Welcome, Fred Blackwell. This is such a privilege to be in your neck of the woods.
Thank you for having me. It's great to have you all in town.
Tell us a little bit about where we are. I mean, as we drove up to the Opera House, we went through a part of San Francisco that I haven't been to before, and I suspect a lot of visitors haven't been to. What's the significance of where we are?
Yeah, well, you're in Bayview Hunters Point in San Francisco. It's the southeastern part of the city, District 10, and it's the part of the city that I've actually spent most of my time working in. And so, I think about this area as important because of I've spent a lot of time here. But I also think about this area as important because it is symbolic of so many other cities like it, where I think so many of the folks who are in our field have spent a lot of time in their careers. I mean, when you think about Bayview Hunters Point, you think about a community that is rich in culture, that has a tremendous number of assets. It's a diverse community, both in terms of the races and ethnicities that are here, but also in terms of income. It's a mixed income community, and it's got a lot of history and character. Bayview Hunters Point, in a lot of ways, is like East Oakland. It's like the central part of Detroit. It's like southeastern DC. It's like the south side of Chicago, where it has all these assets. It has gone through a period of disinvestment, and now there's a lot of concern because cities have been rediscovered. Real estate prices are going up. Housing has become less affordable, and so it's also one of these places where people who have lived through the good times, seen a lot of disinvestment and neglect, and are seeing the city and their community on the edge of good times again, are wondering whether the good times are going to be something that they're going to be able to enjoy. More specifically, though, we're in the Bayview Opera House, the oldest arts and entertainment venue in San Francisco. It survived the 1906 earthquake, and it really has been the centerpiece or the kind of jewel in the crown on 3rd Street, which is the main thoroughfare that goes through Bayview Hunters Point. If you think about a place like Bayview Hunters Point from an African-American perspective, is like the Harlem of the West Coast. 3rd Street is like the 125th Street of the West Coast. And, the Bayview Opera House, dare I say it, could be like the Apollo. And so that's where we are. And that's why I think it's a perfect place for us to be having this kind of conversation.
When you were with the mayor's office, if I recall, you worked with was it Alice Griffith's public housing project, and tried to make sure that sort of came back online in a way that was healthy and viable for the community. I mean, so you go back a ways.
Yeah, I mean, my first kind of stint in local government was here in San Francisco. I was the deputy director of the Mayor's Office of Community Development and became the director of the Mayor's Office of Community Development, and then later on became the head of the Redevelopment Authority here in San Francisco, all under then Mayor, now Governor Gavin Newsom. And when I first came on board, it was to actually kind of take an idea from soup to nuts that Gavin had about making this community, or making the local government in general, more responsive to the southeastern part of the city and Bayview Hunters Point more specifically. And that was a big idea, and we had to try to operationalize that. And one of the ways that we tried to operationalize that was through something called HOPE SF. And what HOPE SF was really about was learning the lessons that many have learned in the process of public housing revitalization, and really trying to bring that to San Francisco, and not to replicate the mistakes that had been made in the past. And one of the biggest mistakes that had been made in the past was that folks kind of thought about public housing revitalization as something that needed to move the people who were living there out of the neighborhood of the community. We were determined not to do that. So a big kind of tenet, a core tenet of HOPE SF was that we were going to really focus in on the bricks and mortar, but we were also going to focus just as much on the kids and families that were living in the housing, and that we would revitalize the public housing, but not displace people in that process. And so that's really what HOPE SF was about. You talked about Alice Griffith. It was one of the kind of initial sites that were a part of HOPE SF. There were 4 of them, and that work is underway. And I can say that we've been successful largely in being able to go through that kind of revitalization process without displacing the families that were already there.
I think there is sort of a sense that the public housing strategies of 10 years ago, 20 years ago, really didn't work very well. That even when we stabilized the housing, even when we were able to make sure that folks were able to stay, that the kinds of supports, the kinds of neighborhoods, the kinds of access to amenities, to jobs, and to everything else just didn't kind of come as a package. And so we ended up being sort of one-dimensional in our response. I mean, how would you differentiate this experience from what that RAP is?
One of the things that was really interesting about the process with HOPE SF is we started with the development of a set of principles. So we named things like replacing all of the public housing on a one-for-one basis. Phased development so that folks didn't have to move off-site during the revitalization process, because one of the things we learned is that when people are spread all over the city or across the region, the likelihood of them coming back is actually really low. We also had a principle that was about integration into the broader community. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I first started doing this work is one of my early meetings with the public housing director or the housing authority director. The public housing director said, what are you doing meeting with my residents? And I thought to myself, I thought that the people who lived in public housing were residents of the city and county of San Francisco. And so these kinds of things were important principles at the front end to really guide how we were going to move the project along. Another one was that we would increase density on these sites. So we knew that we wanted to have, at the end of the day, mixed income communities. We wanted to be able to bring in market rate housing, bring in affordable housing, but to do it in a way that didn't have displacement. And the way to do that was to increase the density. Before we broke ground, before we started to raise money, we spent time thinking about what we wanted this to be. And I think to start with that kind of conversation is really important to do in a community like Bayview Hunters Point.
As you were sort of scrolling through your resume, when you add to that the work you did with the Casey Foundation and the San Francisco Foundation before you ended up in your current job and your current job, I actually did the math and realized that you are 82 years old, which is it's very impressive. You look so good. Yeah, you look great. The public sector experiences that you've just described in some ways seem almost textbook the way the public behaving responsibly should work. Principle-led, deep attention to execution, people-centered, and yet it just seems as if our public sector struggles with those kinds of principles and with those kinds of approaches being sort of sustained over the long term. When you moved over to the philanthropic side, what did you feel you needed to supplement to make sure that the public sector was really firing on all cylinders? I mean, there must have been something that wasn't quite clicking that would cause you to move over from the public sector, where you were doing a lot of things really right, to a philanthropic sector.
When I made the move from the public sector to philanthropy, it wasn't because I was generally in pursuit of a CEO job in philanthropy. I was very specifically interested in the San Francisco Foundation. And there are a few reasons for that. One is, like, while we're called the San Francisco Foundation, we actually have a regional footprint in the Bay Area. The reason why that was important to me is I had actually spent a lot of my time in local government in Oakland and in San Francisco. And one of the things that was always pretty frustrating for me was that people experience the Bay Area as a region. You may live in Oakland, you may live in San Francisco, you may live in Richmond. You could worship in a different part of the Bay. You have friends and family that are all across the region. You get your hair cut in different parts of the Bay Area. People really experience the Bay as a region. That's one thing. The other thing is, we work on issues having to do with jobs, transportation, housing, the environment, education, criminal justice. None of these issues conform neatly to neighborhood or jurisdictional boundaries. Those are also regional in nature. So I felt like we needed to have regional solutions for regional problems. And being able to be at a place like the San Francisco Foundation really allowed to work at that level of scale. This is actually my second tour of duty at the foundation. I was a fellow in the mid-90s. And before that, my first introduction to the San Francisco Foundation. My mom started an organization called the Urban Strategies Council in Oakland, which was about reducing persistent poverty in the city. And I remember I was in high school, when she got a grant from the San Francisco Foundation, and how excited she was that this would enable her to do the kinds of things that she wanted to do in her community. It was always known as a social justice-oriented grant maker in the Bay Area. And the combination of the regional footprint and an institution that had the kind of credibility that the San Francisco Foundation had, but also was unapologetically social justice oriented in the way that it approached the work, felt like a perfect fit for what I thought needed to happen. I loved working in local government, but it was like working in an emergency room. I would look at my calendar the night before I went into work, and the day I went into work looked nothing like what I thought it would look like that night before when I looked at the calendar. And there's a certain amount of energy and adrenaline that comes with that. There is a scale of impact that comes with working in local government when you're able to navigate the bureaucracy and the politics and all that kind of stuff. And I actually miss it. But in philanthropy, that ability to look at the horizon, strategize around how you get there, and then be able to resource the different parts of the road to get you there. And I think that, foundation jobs are some of the best organizing jobs around. And people, I think, don't appreciate that aspect of the work.
One of the things that we've discovered in Detroit, of course, is that people are impatient. If you're going to be a community organizer, get on with it. Make the big play, move the ball quickly. And yet, what you've described is sort of a longer-term perspective, sort of a more incremental approach to change. That kind of patience is tough for community organizers. How do you sort of play both sides of the question?
Taking the long view doesn't mean that you lose the sense of urgency. And when we look around in the communities that we're serving, folks don't have the luxury to think about what the circumstance is going to be often 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And if you adhere too much to what's on the horizon without looking at what's in front of you, you miss an opportunity. So for example, the last 2 years have presented us with a tremendous amount of challenge, but a tremendous amount of opportunity. I've often talked about the fact that I've spent a career focused in on racial equity and economic justice and those kinds of things, and doing it in a kind of buttoned up and professional way. Trying to bring the best data to the table, disaggregate it to make your case. Really putting together well-written memos and well-done PowerPoints where you have just the right number of bullets and white space. And I felt like in the summer of 2020, the outrage of young people around what they saw with the murder of George Floyd was able to create some opportunities that weren't possible with my data and my memos and my PowerPoints. What it told me was about the efficacy of emotion and anger in this work, and what that means in addition to all that professional stuff that is also required and necessary. And it's that kind of urgency that I think is important for us all to keep in mind, even as we think about what's on the horizon. And that's a perfect example. Like we drew a line in the sand around racial equity and economic inclusion, made that our North Star in 2015. And that was prior to a lot of stuff that has called these concepts into people's consciousness at a greater level today. But we saw an opportunity based on the last couple of years to really push even harder and to make investments that were even more bold to get towards that North Star. And so I would say that's how we try to balance the kind of long-term view with the short-term opportunities and the sense of urgency that I think is necessary to do this work.
When I think of the San Francisco Foundation under your leadership, it's a very different kind of community foundation. It's really a forward-leaning organization. You've been a national leader on affordable housing, housing preservation, housing protection. You've clearly articulated standards of equity and opportunity that I think are highly powerful and perhaps even unusual in the community foundation field. And so I think it crosses a lot of people's mind. How do you do that? I think we see a lot of rhetoric and a lot of heat and a lot of Sturm and Drang around issues of racial opportunity and the moment of reckoning and how do you transform a moment into a movement. And yet you seem to have done that. Can you give me just a couple of examples of what tactically have you done to sort of make the pivot from your memos to your passion?
We went out and listened to community. And we went throughout the region to have conversations with people about how they were describing their neighborhood, trends that they saw in their communities, both positive and negative, and the kinds of roles that an institution like ours could play and be responsive to the dynamics at the neighborhood level. About a year into working at the foundation, somebody asked me how I was doing. And my answer was, I'm not sure. And the reason why I wasn't sure is, after working in local government, and you have this experience too, so you know it, no one's shy to tell you how they feel about your work when you're working in local government. At that time, it had been a year since I had been yelled at a community meeting. And so there's a certain amount of discomfort that I have, to tell you the truth, in not feeling connected to the hopes, aspirations, and frustrations that people articulate when you're in their community. And so I thought that was really important for us to do early on, and we learned a lot there. One thing I will say about this, without going into excruciating detail, is that in every meeting that we showed up at the end, people started to have conversations about race and class. And I attributed that to two things. I thought, one, they didn't want us to leave without us knowing that these issues were prevalent in their community. But it also takes a long time to get warmed up to conversations about race and class. And so that was one of the things that I think was an important pillar of the early stages of our work. Another thing that I think was important was, I talked about this a little bit earlier, data. We looked at data disaggregated by neighborhood, by race, by gender, by issue area. We often described ourselves as drinking data from a fire hose and really trying to better understand what the dynamics were, what the conditions were in the communities that we were serving. And the data, Rip, told the exact same story that we heard from when we talked to people in communities. So that the qualitative information and the quantitative information were lining up. It was basically telling us that there was a lot of economic growth, prosperity being generated here in the Bay Area, and that access to it was limited. That pointed us in a direction of where the problems and the opportunities were, but it didn't tell us much about solutions. So we went back to community with the data, and we asked community, how do we get here? And it was in the answers to how we got here that we started to think about and get clear about maybe how we get to a better place. We've been in the community for 75 years next year. If I've said we've always been a social justice-oriented organization, so we have partners, and we have a certain amount of credibility that when we show up, and people will tell us where we need to go. So that's a really important component. Another component, we've committed to using every tool in our tool belt in order to move the needle on our North Star around racial equity and economic inclusion. We have relationships, we have reputation, we have networks. We have $2 billion of assets under management. As you know, we invest those dollars to try to grow them for grant making. Where's that money going? Who's managing those dollars? When we bring on consultants, who are those people? What's their complexion? We've got a staff of maybe over 100 people. Who are those folks? How are we recruiting them? What parts of the community are they coming from? All that stuff, our board, their networks, their relationships, all of that is moving in the direction of trying to move the needle on racial equity. And so my mom, she told me something that I think is really true. We in the foundation world spend a lot of time developing reputations. That's a big part of our kind of social capital in the field. And my mom says, what's the use of developing a reputation if you're not willing to risk it? Yeah. And so the big thing that we do is we put our reputation on the line. We're saying that if we can be clear around what we believe in, mobilize the community around resources and use our leadership to move that needle and be associated with that, we will attract donors, but more importantly, we'll attract donors that are interested in being a part of that journey. And that cumulative piece is what will move the needle.
It's a really powerful articulation of, I think, a next generation model of community foundations. You once said to me that we're not about being neutral. We're not about making complex things simple. And we're not about being the least cost service provider. And yet those three things that you're not are the path of least resistance, right?
Nor are we interested in the arms race around assets under management. I told the foundation when I was interviewing the trustees, if this road takes us down the path of becoming the largest community foundation in the country, so be it. But that's not the goal. The goal is to move the needle.
I was curious when you said that about whether you would find management of donors who were used to working in a certain way, not just in your foundation, but in other foundations, would sort of head for the exits. And you pointed out to me that when you began, you were bringing in about $75 million of new donor money a year, and you're now up to $150 million. So there's an alchemy in what you have done. I mean, if you were to get a call tomorrow morning, just hypothetically, and they said, what are the 4 things that we can do to sort of move away from this fairly traditional Fidelity Schwab kind of model to something that looks more like the San Francisco Foundation? What would those things be?
Foster a very strong connection to community. Yeah. Develop a North Star, because without a North Star and something that you're working towards, everything looks like it can be in your mission or in your wheelhouse. So develop a North Star and be clear about it. Be prepared to measure your impact against that North Star and be accountable towards it, both inside your institution and with the communities that you're working in. Be prepared to lose some donors. Have that conversation with the board about the fact that not everybody is going to be happy with this conversation about how big the tent really needs to be in order to move the needle. And so I think all of that, is a really important part of the secret sauce. And then the last thing that I would mention, make sure that you spend the time from the staff level to the governance and the board of trustees, thinking about what it is you're trying to do and what you're willing to risk in order to get there.
You began by describing the geographic reach of the foundation. It's huge. Mm-hmm. San Francisco is an ethnically and racially deeply diverse community. The issues you've described sort of run the spectrum of complexity, from housing to asset building to transit to everything else. Mm-hmm. How do you prevent that complexity from just sort of watering down what it is you do? I mean, the kind of integrative planning that you've described is probably the hardest thing there is to do, and you know that from government. You ask a government to integrate the pieces and they just sort of tense up. What prevents you from tensing up?
I would say there are a few things that keep us from getting atrophied or paralyzed around the both the breadth and complexity of the work. One is what I said before, really kind of thinking hard about what the North Star is. What goes from there is we spent a lot of time thinking about what the levers were that needed to be pulled in order to make progress against the North Star, and whether we were positioned to pull those levers or not. So really thinking about you as an institution and where your lane is and what you have the capacity to do and what you don't have the capacity to do. Folks think about foundation jobs as fabulous places to provide support to things that they like. But the reality of the job is that you say no way more than you say yes. And so being prepared to be disciplined about what you're going to engage in, at what level of intensity you're going to engage in as well, is I think an important thing. In our housing work, we're doing this stuff with our trustees, we're making grants, we are pulling donors in, we're engaged in programmatic work and policy work, which means that we're in Sacramento, and from time to time we will get involved in ballot initiatives where our investments are headed in this direction. What we've learned is that we cannot deploy all of those resources on every issue that we're focused in on. So intensity becomes a very important conversation. There's some areas where we're going to throw everything in and the kitchen sink at it, but there's some areas where we'll just be a grant maker. There are some areas where we feel like there may be a void in leadership and there's the space for us to lead, but there are other areas where we're just around the table and we're following. So really thinking about your role, I think is a very important thing to do as well. At the end of the day, we want to see population level change on these issues. So if we're working on housing issues, we're not going to measure our impact just by the number of housing units that got produced by the little grants that we make at the San Francisco Foundation. We want to see a certain percentage of the people in the region paying less than 30%, which is the definition of being burdened from a rental point of view, less than 30% of their income on housing. We want to see a certain percentage of the folks in the region being able to make ends meet from an economic point of view. We want to see a certain percentage of new and infrequent voters going to the polls in November. We want to see population level change. It really gives you a better sense of what the ecosystem needs to look like for change and what your aligned contribution is within that ecosystem. That's another thing that keeps us from being overwhelmed. We're not arrogant enough to think that our work alone or our grants alone are going to move the needle on housing. There's local government, there are people on the ground, there are other philanthropic institutions, there are other sectors. The question is, how do we get all of them mobilized around these issues?
That's what it makes me think of, is you've got the private sector, right? In the Bay Area, the private sector and the housing market is a pretty powerful piece of machinery, and one that has traditionally been somewhat resistant to the kinds of interventions that philanthropy is able and willing to make. So how do you solve for that one?
Well, resistant, Rip, until it came to their doorstep. One of the things that we did when we were developing this North Star around racial equity and economic inclusion is at the tail end of it, when we thought that the strategy was starting to cement, we started to do a bunch of focus groups. And one of the focus groups we did was with some of the private sector folks in the Bay Area. There was some banking people, there was some tech folks, some folks from the health sector. Of all the kind of listening sessions that we did in focus groups, this was by far the worst one. They were bad for a few reasons. One, it became very clear early on that we didn't speak the same language they were speaking. It also became clear early on that they are seldom in the room together, and so they were sizing each other up. And then one person went as far as to just name it and said, Fred, we don't really work with the NASCAR approach. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? Well, when you see NASCAR and there are a bunch of different logos on the car, that's not how we operate. We want our logo on the car. So we left that meeting kind of discouraged and said, we're just going to go about doing the work. Then a couple of years later, as these companies were finding it difficult to find and recruit talent because talent wasn't willing to live in the Bay Area because it wasn't affordable, when they got tired of seeing their salary schedule just go out of control because they were trying to keep up with housing costs, when their programmers who were making well north of $100,000 a year were complaining that they couldn't afford housing in the Bay Area, guess what? They came to us and said, hey, how can we work on this together? I'm in this work because I think it's the moral thing to do. I think it's the right thing to do. I think it's the ethical thing to do. But some folks arrive at the table because it's the right thing to do from a monetary point of view, or it makes sense in terms of their business plan. And my thing is, that's okay. Whatever your motivation is, if we're going to come to the table and try to solve this together, this is the table for you to come to. And I think that was an important lesson for me.
The situation of the Bay Area would seem to almost compel that kind of response for exactly the reasons you've suggested. When I was in Minneapolis, we sort of did it in reverse. We basically tried to get all of the CEOs from the major corporations in Minneapolis and St. Paul together to sort of map out what the region might need from their perspective to do a little bit better job sort of integrating housing, transit, and other things. And we landed on 4 or 5 working groups. Mm-hmm. We then populated it with nonprofits. We took it into community to sort of create a little bit of iteration, but not nearly what you've described. And what we found was when the CEOs were almost given the latitude to think in the absence of emergency, they actually thought very creatively, and they were able to think outside of their self-interest in a really powerful way. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, you had people from a hotel company talking about early childhood development. You had someone from a medical technology company talking about transit. And as a result, it really stuck and got into the sort of the groundwater of the business community's agenda. Do you worry at all that if and when we can hope the affordable housing crisis hits some kind of equilibrium in the Bay Area, that the job has been done and the private sector kind of walks away and goes back to its normal behavior?
I think it's possible, Rip, but we also found that all of our private sector partners are not created equally. For example, hospitals and healthcare providers tend to have a different kind of orientation to their backyard, a different kind of appreciation for the role that they play in community. than, say, a banking institution. We found that the toughest nut to crack was the tech community. And that was because they almost to a firm viewed themselves as kind of institutions that had a Bay Area address, but a global footprint. Their association with the community was one where the earth was their backyard. It wasn't until there were issues that were very localized that started to impact their workforce and their business that they started to come to the table. And I think, Rip, that the experience of coming to the table around issues like housing, around issues like homelessness, have opened their eyes to their responsibility as a partner, but also the benefits to them as a company for having a healthy and thriving backyard as well. My hope is that we won't experience that retreat because folks have seen a different kind of way to work with one another and work across sectors for local problem solving and the importance of actually engaging in local problem solving. But I think the risk that we run by inviting the sector into this local problem solving is that they can have a tendency to think that they have the answers when the answers really exist in community. And so getting them to that place where they're willing to work in partnership with community is going to be essential towards having them as the right kind of partner.
So in many ways, the San Francisco Foundation is an aggregator of community voice. It's something of a translator of community voice. It's a facilitator of community voice. I mean, there's a lot of ways in which you're encouraging sort of the clear and enduring articulation of community values and priorities. But that's complicated, isn't it?
It is very complicated, and it involves some reputational risk. I've had community partners tell me, Fred, we are only here because you invited us and you told us that this is going to be a place where our voice was going to be heard. And so if that turns out not to be the case, we've lost some credibility. It requires us to be transparent with everybody about what they're walking into. It requires us to do the best that we can to create the space where all the voices are going to be heard. It requires us to, when that's not happening, call out some of the partners that aren't doing that, and sometimes call out the folks who maybe are too strident in what they believe in to be a partner on the other end as well. One of the more tricky things that we did was I was the co-chair of something that was convened on a regional level to come up with a kind of 10-point policy-oriented program on things that we would do from a housing point of view in the region. And we intentionally invited folks who agreed that there was a housing problem, but disagreed sometimes violently on what the solutions needed to be. And what we ended up with, Rip, was a place where everybody had a much greater appreciation for what the other was saying. You know, folks have been talking by each other for years, if not decades. You know, the folks who thought that the silver bullet was tenant protection weren't talking to the people who felt like the silver bullet was production of more affordable housing. We spent a year and a half in rooms like this, locking people in, trying to find out where the higher common denominator was. And one of the things that was really interesting is at the end of it, everybody had the same aha, which was everybody had been going to Sacramento with their silver bullet. And it would never get through the legislative process. It wasn't until we all showed up together in saying that we wanted to see this package of things move forward that we got the wins. And so it was a very important learning for us and for other folks, but getting there was extremely intense.
You're playing this sort of intermediating role. And if you're trying to aggregate perspective and approach up to a legislature, it seems to me that it's tactical in some ways. You know, how do you construct something that has a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of that, and we all sort of meet in the middle. But an ongoing role that I assume creates some risk. And I'm thinking particularly of our experience in Detroit, where during the sort of the nadir of Detroit's economic troubles, 2008, 2013, before the bankruptcy, city government was just in no place to do much except just kind of keep their chin above water. And so we stepped in with a whole suite of activities, from transit to childhood education to all sorts of other things. And we ended up being accused of playing that mezzo level role inappropriately. That we essentially were moving into space that was more properly occupied by people with election certificates. And it was very hard. Is there a risk of that here?
I think there's always a risk of that. And there's another risk for a philanthropic institution too, which is the risk of stepping into the space in a way that supplants the power and voice of our partners who we are funders of. And so I think both of those are in play. They both require you to pay close attention to what's being said and stay in close contact with all those players, whether they're elected, appointed, or folks who are on the ground who have constituency, and stay proximate.
So how does that all play out in the current circumstance where you've got this sort of waterfall of federal dollars for COVID relief and for infrastructure? Have you thought at all about what the role of the foundation can be in making sure that some of those dollars hit ground equitably? I mean, those kind of complicated pieces of implementation machinery are not something that philanthropy often thinks about.
We have dabbled into that in ways that have made us at times not be totally comfortable. Again, a housing example. There are kind of two legs to the stool. One is we have an investment fund, and the investment fund is where we are trying to get more corporate and philanthropic dollars into the affordable housing funding stream. Our partner is LISC, and that work is going well. It's a $500 million fund. The trickier one is a fund that we call the policy fund. And the policy fund is set aside to provide direct financial assistance, technical assistance, and staff support to local governments that are pursuing housing policy that we think are in line with the principles that we have laid out around what we're trying to do. So there are literally staff people paid for by philanthropic dollars that are embedded in local government that expand the capacity of local government to advance housing policy. There's also a part of that that is a grant directly to a community group to be a partner with local government. So that partnership is developed at the front end rather than having the Tom and Jerry-like relationship that local government and community-based organizations usually have when it comes to policy formulation. They're working on it together. So that's just an example of where, we have been really in it to the level where we're saying, hey, local government, we will give you support. We think that that is really important, to really invest in the capacity of local government to deliver. And we've been working with the Silicon Valley Community Foundation and with the Packard Foundation to actually place people again in local government who can help with the identification of the state and federal dollars that are coming down the pipeline, play circuit rider on making sure that the left hand knows what the right hand is doing when it comes to expenditures of those dollars, and to do it with an equity frame that keeps in mind making sure that those who are least likely to see the benefits of these things actually do see the benefits.
One of the smartest things we did in the downturn period in Detroit was to create something called the Detroit Revitalization Fellows, in which we did something similar. We not only enabled City Hall to take fellows, I think almost a dozen, but then we also placed people in key agency roles throughout the city, public, private, nonprofit. And what we found was that form of capacity building wasn't a one-shot and done kind of proposition, that these became roles so critical to those institutions that they found ways over time to sustain them, and that the fellows themselves created a network. And one of the things that we struggled with in Detroit, is probably not as much of an issue for the Bay, is that network became a recruiting tool for young talent into the city. You could see that there were 19 fellows this year and 22 fellows the next year, and they began comparing notes and learning from one another, and they created their own informal network of learning and professional development.
Yeah, the fellows model is very powerful. We have a fellowship program at the San Francisco Foundation too, where we kind of bring in folks who are early to mid-career people of color and really try to advance their careers by immersing them in the foundation. And we find that it's a really great model to spin out leaders that are working on all kinds of things in the sector.
You are doing so much in such a complicated environment. You're working in horizontal dimensions, you're working in vertical dimensions, you're working in third dimensions of policy and capacity building. Where do you go from here?
First of all, we feel like we are at the front end of this work. We're nowhere near the conclusion. We're going to continue to push and push hard on these issues. Continue to have big ambition. Continue to try to figure out how to have a narrative that both, on the one hand, shines a light on what needs to happen and call our community to task on it, but also at the same time have a message that's inviting. So we will continue to try to get more comfortable with the discomfort that is associated with all of this work. The last thing I'll say on this that I think is really important that I like to do is really define what equity is. I have a friend who says that equity is the new coconut water, which I interpret as, you hear a lot of people talking about it, but not a whole lot of people drinking it. And so equity is just and fair inclusion in a society where everyone can participate, prosper, thrive, and reach their full potential. And if that is the definition of equity and we're trying to achieve it, that is something that none of us has really experienced in this country. So that means that the solutions are on the horizon, not in the rearview mirror. And so we really have to be able to lean into the discomfort that is associated with being in pursuit of that destination, the discomfort that is associated with conversations about race and class, the discomfort that is associated, particularly today, with politics and policy when all of those conversations are so polarized.
I can't tell you, Fred, how fortunate the foundation community is to have someone who is not afraid to sort of turn discomfort into opportunity and forward motion. I think the vision you've described is in and of itself just quite extraordinary, but the engineering that you've done behind that vision is just exemplary. It's such a privilege to watch you work, and I can only imagine what your next 8 years at the foundation will look like. It's going to be something to watch. So thank you for your time. We so appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.